Welcome to Chapter 5, where we'll be covering all of the essential info for the time period of middle and late childhood. As you can see, I have included both middle and late childhood, and we can see the general age range. I mean, we can basically consider it the major lifespan developmental chunk that happens before adolescence. So we're finishing up, for example, elementary school, maybe starting traditional middle school age ranges. And we also see that even though it includes both middle to late childhood, some textbooks will break those down separately. For most part, I'm referring to the entire middle to late childhood, although I'm only going to refer to it as middle childhood from now on. Let's start with what's happening in the brain. We see this idea of cortical thickening in certain areas. And again, this general pattern is that up until age 2, more synapses, more connections between neurons, more total neurons, and again, not uniformly through every area of the cortex, but after age 2, the general pattern is killing off or synaptic death of those neurons and pathways that aren't being used, and then what is being used and what remains is strengthened, which is essentially myelination, and that's what the cortical thickening is. So it is replacing what used to be unused pathways with now thickened or heavily myelinated pathways. And we can see generally the pattern from, again, around age 2 throughout childhood and even in some areas of adolescence and even into our 20s. For some localized areas of the brain, we see an increased amount of this white matter, and most of that is not exactly visible from the outside of the brain, and it can start to push and get further toward the outer wall of the gray matter, which some gray matter certainly is still going to remain in adulthood, but the general pattern is more of these heavily myelinated and efficient and fast pathways. Now, specifically, what kind of areas of the brain in middle childhood reach their peak thickness and then can stop changing largely throughout the rest of the lifespan? Well, we see certainly this area of the temporal lobe, which corresponds to language understanding, so the meaning of words. And we see a lot of that area in, for example, this part of the temporal lobe, specifically Wernicke's area, if you remember from Intro to Psych, but that's not going to be on the exam for our purposes. And we all talked about for Chapter 4, early childhood, we saw an increase in the thickening of the PFC, the prefrontal cortex, and again, that corresponds to our ability to pay attention to things. And so clearly, we see right here, right behind the forehead, a lot of development and thickening in that area. And what that corresponds to is during middle childhood, children can process language and the meaning of language at largely adult levels. Those areas of the brain have reached their development and are basically done changing. And they can also focus their attention in an adult-like capacity. So again, the synaptic pruning continues, but the rate slows. And it especially has a lot to do with areas in the frontal lobe, as we'll talk about with adolescents, that are still not really close to their adult levels. Areas that involve judgment and decision making, morality. We're not going to really be talking about those this chapter because those areas of the brain still have to develop, and they're going to do so more in adolescence than in middle to childhood. And again, doing more with less, it sounds like if you're having synaptic pruning, that's a bad thing. You're losing brain tissue. But the reality is you have pruning first, and then that allows for the thickening, or essentially the cement, to dry in the brain, and those pathways are solidified, and hopefully they're nice and efficient by this age range. Won't spend too much time on this slide, but we see some differences in terms of what would later on be differences in intelligence in terms of when peak thickening happens. And I think we see this blue line compared to the red line is the superior versus average intelligence. And we see that the red line reaches its thickening state, peak thickness, at an earlier age than those who will later have superior intelligence. So, is it good to have your brain or parts of your brain thickened first or later? I still don't think we really understand that from this, but I think we have a lot to learn about what is normal development of the brain, and if there is deviation from that or abnormal, will we predict good things, for example, superior intelligence, or was it linked to maybe disabilities or lower performance and other things? So all I wanted to say here is that there are some interesting differences in the developmental patterns of the cortex involving thickness that we still need to understand. If we talk about some other milestones catching up on patterns of development that we've talked about before, we see with motor development at 6 years old, we should be able to do basic things, functional aspects of our life, such as buttoning shirts, tying shoes. And then we see by 10 to 12 years, the extent of motor development has really kicked in. And we see that fine motor skills can equal adults. It's not that they always will, because maybe some kids aren't typing on a keyboard. But if they are, involve typing, controlling brushes, paint brushes, or pencils and pens, with the amount of practice, the fine motor skills can equal adults in this age range. So in some ways, they're starting to become little adults. In other ways, they still have a long way to go. And so you see here the example of prodigies. So for example, if a child is spending hours every day at the piano, by the time just before adolescence, they could functionally be as technically a gifted pianist as any out there. Now, they probably won't have as much of a functional understanding of the nuances of music, and that's a different thing, but being able to just manipulate your hands with the right amount of practice, they can get there. We also see some general gender differences. And for example, motor skills, we see boys will be a little bit more advanced with motor skills, girls with fine motor skills. I don't think this is due to genetic inherent differences, but maybe some differences in the socialization of what different genders are interested in doing or what activities are more and less available to them. I think the idea is, of course, we want to get them access and motivation to do as much motor skill development as is reasonably possible. Again, with the idea that we'll talk about obesity and especially why this might be a sensitive period for obesity that predicts later adult weight problems. We need to get our kids out moving more and more and more, and I think we're just not seeing as much of that as we used to, and it falls more on the parents and less on the schools and other activities, and we'll talk about some of those issues. We also see some cultural differences, maybe some racial ethnic differences. Historically, cardiovascular disease in children is extremely rare, and in some cultures around the world, you don't see it, essentially. It is very close to zero. Of course, we as a United States culture have certain diet issues and some less need for physical activity compared to some other cultures that I'm thinking of. So we have more obesity here in the U.S. There's just no doubt about it. And also, we can have a bunch of different definitions of obesity, whether it's 95% over average body mass index. I mean, the exact number is less of the problem. And it's less of an issue to me whether a child is specifically or officially overweight versus obese. I think in general, all children should be more active, and we can reduce things like childhood obesity with policy and more attention and funding in a lot of ways. And again, we'll talk about this in a little bit. So for example, historically, we're looking at United States children, and we have a very wide age range here, 2 to 19 years, and also running through a nice longitudinal time span. In the 70s, 5% of kids were obese. We get to the 80s, people have suggested that the increase in or accessibility of video games was causing kids to be couch potatoes. in some way, and that may have this is just a correlation that video games preceded further increases, but they did not start this trend of obesity, that's for sure. And we see the introduction of certain hormones and steroids, additives to some of the things that we eat, suggested to cause differences in metabolism. And then we have, at the start of the 2000s, now the divergence of genders, the introduction of high fructose corn syrup, where basically it gets put in almost anything that's highly processed food. And we can see we had a little dip toward the end of the 2010, or just before the 2010 decade, but this clear divergence. So now both genders clearly are much more likely to be obese. A 10-point increase is drastic, but then boys also have almost a 5% greater chance of being obese. And there are lots of examples where we can talk about how there's issues for both genders, but it seems like in this one example, boys are often falling behind girls in terms of developmental milestones. Now, this is something that we definitely could talk about for our discussions, and there's no easy answers here. The idea is everybody wants to make kids happy, and one way to do that is to give them a treat. And we have all sorts of rituals that involve food. And how many holidays can you have where you're eating cake and junk food and pizza? But of course, when you get into schools, once one kid has cupcakes or a pizza party, then everyone can have that, just to be fair. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that basically, like a lot of other things, we are dealing with the outcomes of childhood obesity, which is lots of health concerns and a greater risk of adult obesity in general. And that's the expensive part. If we just make small investments in our kids, that could cause great savings later on. If just we have a 20 or greater reduction in childhood obesity, and then we have 20% reduction in adult obesity, that's going to free up a lot of money, I think. We also have, for example, if we see an obese family, we blame the parents because they are the most direct link to taking care of the kid. But we have this whole structure of food around us in which, for example, a lot of things that are packed with sugar and fat naturally would be more expensive than eating vegetables. But our national subsidies support and pick winners, oftentimes that are providers of the lower nutritious food. And so we are essentially getting intentionally cheaper non-nutritional food, and then our nutritional food we pay actual market rate for. And we also, of course, have the advertising thing. So, if kids are begging for this food or candy that they've seen on TV over and over and over again, it shouldn't all be the parents' fault when they give in once in a while. So again, we can point the blame at the government, at schools, at parents, and of course, corporate America. And when you have the diffusion of blame that is so widespread, typically no one gets the full blame. Won't focus too much on this either, but we see a lot of the outcomes of childhood obesity. And this is not just later on, this can be while they're still children. So clearly poor nutrition and oftentimes fattier food and packed with sugar food, refined food, is going to have lesser nutritional value. That shows up in terms of less healthy bone structure, joint disease. Of course, we have the gastrointestinal issues, and of course, the cardiovascular issues, and hypertension, risk of coronary disease, inflammation, and then of course we have the psychological outcomes too. Lower quality of life, poor self-esteem, and we can talk about how that might limit for example, Erikson's psychosocial development of the self, if obesity gets in the way of that. And then the issue is, what's the difference between a chubby or a husky child and one that's overweight and obese? And at what age of course, any one adult can be an obese child and be a healthy weight adult. But at what age is the likelihood of that so low that we really need to try and intervene and prevent it? And I don't think I know the answer right now, but I think it probably is at earlier ages than we guess. So once we get to obese adolescents, I think the likelihood that they become healthy weight adults is much, much less than if we had intervened and not let it get to that point earlier in childhood. Here's where we talk about some regional or perhaps cultural issues. And what we see here is basically some states, so we're looking at Colorado and large areas of New England, have less than half the obesity of some other states, such as West Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi. Now, of course, Colorado and New England tends to be a higher socioeconomic status, and it could be the difference between, eating a bowl of clam chowder versus a bowl of gumbo. And West Virginia is known as at least it has been in the past, as the pizza delivery capital of the world, which the more pizza's great, but the more of it you eat, the more likely that your population is going to be obese. We also see the issue here, and going back to the 70s, it's even hard to imagine that 80% of children were involved in daily phys ed. I know growing up, we might have had phys ed twice a week, and some schools I'm sure are down to one, or when you have to make budget cuts, it's things like phys ed and music and art that are the first to go. And I think it's a bad situation when it seems very abnormal for kids to get daily structured exercise in the school system. And I think it's definitely something that we should prioritize more. And sort of related to this idea is we've talked about all these consequences of obesity, and there's other issues and things that kids can get cancer, for example. We normally think of kids, on the other hand, if they don't have any of these major disorders or diseases, as being pretty indestructible, but that's actually not true. And if we think about the leading cause of death in childhood, it is simple accidents. And so we have to choose between letting our kids jump on a trampoline without any guards, unattended, versus all kids are in a bubble and we prevent as much as possible their exposure to accidents. Now, of course, you have to find for most parents, find some middle ground in there. And I think, especially given research that's been done at higher levels with adults, such as the NFL, we've found that there is a clear link between hits to the head that do not meet the threshold of a concussion. And the more of those that you get, the more likely you're going to have some form of brain damage. The most common one, at least that we're seeing now, is a very serious form, CTE, chronic traumatic encephalitis. But I think even not reaching that standard, there's still a lot of area where hits to the head can damage your brain in ways that you may never see as a parent or as a child, and you don't know the limitations that or difficulties that might have been introduced because they're not drastic. And of course, what are some of the solutions? You can have no tackle football for younger kids, no taking headers in soccer practice, definitely coach training and awareness for concussions, but also sub-concussion symptoms. It's not just if they're slurring their speech or blacked out, but also identify when a headshot has happened and have protocols built in. And of course, headgear, helmets, mouth guards, And I think when I was growing up, it stuck out when a child was riding their bike with a helmet. I think it's good that we're in a place now where that is not so much the case. So hopefully it's more normalized, just like wearing a mask during a pandemic, that it's normal to see people wearing helmets when they're engaged in a potentially dangerous behavior. Let's talk about the idea of learning disabilities. I think many people tend to view a learning disability as more global than they really are, when the definition is outside of any obvious cause, such as a disease or a neurological or brain injury issue. And it's also not a global mental disability. It's not a developmental disorder, such as autism or ADHD. Instead, it is something that doesn't have a clear cause, and it usually is just a specific school skill. So dyslexia is a classic example, much more common than previously believed, or it can be a specific reading or math or other impairment. And then how do you deal with children who have learning disabilities? Well, this idea is the concept of least restrictive environment. If they only need help or intervention with one very specific school-related situation, then all other aspects of their school experience should be normal and similar to kids without the learning disability. And this is similar to the concept of reasonable accommodation, which involves the Americans with Disability Act. Basically, you can't discriminate on against people who have some sort of disability in terms of who gets a job, in terms of who is offered an educational opportunity, for example, when the idea is if you could just make some sort of reasonable accommodation to the work environment, that they would be able to perform all the essential tasks. So obviously things like ramps, but also accommodations for visual impairment. And the idea is very similar with a learning disability. It's one very specific thing that if you offer them help, they will be able to perform every aspect as an average person would be expected to. Here's a little bit about dyslexia. There are some common misconceptions. It is estimated in that bottom left-hand corner that 1 in 10 people have dyslexia, and we can see some of the issues about self-regulation are what define dyslexia: organizational skills, time management. But we see the things they're good at are thinking outside the box and creative thinking. And so we also see that perhaps 35% of entrepreneurs, which involve thinking creatively in situations and environments, are dyslexic. So it is not, again, tied to a global ability such as intelligence or IQ, but is instead specific to some of these self-regulation components. And so if a teacher just needs to offer a few reminders to do basic things such as show your work or put your name on your work, and that will cause them to get A's instead of B's on assignments, that seems to be a pretty reasonable accommodation. If we turn to Piaget, we see that this stage is defined by what he referred to as concrete operations. Concrete, as contrasted from the early childhood stage, the pre-operational stage, which was somewhat a blurred boundary between reality and pretend and imagination. Concrete, on the other hand, that boundary has been crossed and there's no going back. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another couple features that we need to consider is the idea of conservation of mass. So if I pour this one into the taller container, do they have the same? Now they're going to get that answer right once they hit middle childhood. And also the transitivity property or transitive inference. So there's all sorts of these examples. If, for example, one team A beats Team B, but Team B lost to Team C, is Team A better than Team C? Who gets to go to the playoffs? Lots of our life is filled with these kinds of transitive property judgments. And two things are important to consider. First of all, their working memory has to be mature enough to juggle three separate things and three relationships between things in your working memory at once. And you have to have the sort of logic to be able to work through it. And we only start to see that once we get to middle childhood. Also, we talked about, for early childhood, the idea of centering, being able to focus your attention. Well, what comes next is, once you're able to focus your attention and get locked in, you have to then be able to decenter or shift your attention. So, for example, an 8-year-old might be able to really focus on playing a video game, so much so that they're not hearing mom saying that they need to clean their room. So what normally should happen is you are paying attention to your video game with enough awareness of your surroundings that when something important comes up, that then you decenter from the video game, center again on getting your room clean, decenter from that task, and then go back to the video game or whatever else comes next. And notice this is not the idea of multitasking, doing multiple things at once, which is basically throughout the lifespan less efficient than single tasking things. And this is more how an adult attention works. You have to focus on one thing, and then when something else comes up, you deal with that, and then you can go back to your first task. So Piaget identified this pattern starting to show in middle childhood. And of course, if we see the concrete operational stage, logic was very limited in the pre-operational stage. But now we see lots of application of logic, and in many ways over applying basic logic. And we'll see examples of this in a little bit. If we look at language acquisition, we see that the initial development of language pragmatics in early childhood, which is the idea that you're developing a theory of mind, you can put yourself in the minds of your audience to some extent. Well, that ability is increasing in middle adulthood, and the pragmatics continues in the level of storytelling. So for example, if a child is reading Captain Underpants, it's a very easy thing to read for a 6-year-old, and you ask them what happens. They'll give you a very high level story about some maybe 5 or 6 key details of the story. Fast forward from the 6-year-old to the 10-year-old, and they'll be giving you all sorts of detail, backstories, interconnectedness, relationships between characters, oftentimes more than you actually want to hear as the audience. And we'll see how that's different and reflective of something important about their understanding. The details matter in this age range, and if you don't get the details exactly right, then you're getting the problem wrong. If we talk about second languages, remember to have the brain wiring to be able to distinguish between all the sounds of a second language, you should be exposed to it by a native speaker in the household in the first year of life. Now, if that doesn't happen, which in most cases doesn't, does that mean that the child can't learn a second language? Not at all. You can learn to be a very efficient speaker of a second language, and the most efficient time to pick that up would be this early age range of 3 to 7. And of course, in many schools, you would not have a full-time second language speaker in elementary school or shared between middle school and elementary school. But if we really want to emphasize the learning of second languages most efficiently, it should start in elementary school or at least middle school before high school. We also see interesting findings for bilingual students. Let's say some students are taking an hour of English every day. Other students are taking a half hour of English, a half hour of Spanish. You give both groups the English test. The bilingual students will actually perform better on English, even though they've only been getting half of the amount of time on English work. And I think what that finding shows us is that to learn only one language is putting a limit on your understanding of language. And the scary thing about that is you've put a ceiling on people's understanding of the complexity and nuance of language, and they understand their world through that language, so they never really realize how they're limited. You know, the classic phrase that you don't know what you don't know, and if you only learn one language, there's a lot you don't know, and you're living your life in many ways unaware of that. It's not like being monolingual or speaking one language is a very large hindrance, but I think it really is an example of putting a ceiling on the complexity and richness that we can get if we would put an emphasis on learning multiple languages. We can also talk about how things should look in the classroom, and I like the idea of zone of proximal development in terms of scaffolds, especially with this bottom row here. So first off, we have I do, you watch, and this often reflects the top-down, old school, traditional model of education. And there is still a point in which this is an effective aspect of teaching. But we also have to then do the next stages too, and this goes more to the child-centered kindergarten or school approach, where you start to have some small groups, some structured stuff where you set up the rules or set up the goals, and then they're on their own to some extent, and the teacher is available as a resource rather than specifically a model or an instructor. And then finally, we should get a lot of, at the end of the zone, a lot of independent, in this case, reading and internalization. So you've learned how to do this thing. It'd be nice if you internalized that it's a valuable thing, not just to be able to do, but to share with others. Also talked about how children's memory is a little bit different from that of an adult. So the memory pathways have turned on and they're working well, but they're almost limited to those factual details. And this is not in the textbook currently, but I've seen it in the past, and I think it really does illustrate the difference between the concrete operational thinker and then what comes next, the formal operations in adolescence. So formal operations and adults generally use a type of memory called gist. So for example, if you ask them a question about another person, what's the deal with this person? You don't need their whole life story, right? You want the basic understanding, a couple key pieces of information that you can remember and that you can fill in the blanks later on if you need to. So it allows for elaboration. If you need to follow up and get more understanding, you can, but the basic idea is the gist, and that's good enough. So for example, even if you're watching a movie without the sound, you can still fill in the blanks and say, this is why somebody pointed at that guy. It's potentially limited by errors. You might make some mistakes when you elaborate or use inferences, but for the most part, it saves us the brain power of having to remember every little detail. Now, contrast that with how the concrete operational thinker is. They are using verbatim memory, which is the exact details. So in our family, there was a 6-year-old who every time he came out of the bathroom, he would tell people to don't put kitty litter in the toilet. And when they would go in the bathroom, he would tell them this. And they wondered, where's he getting this from? No one's ever told him this. But while he was doing his business, reading the kitty litter box, and that's what it said on the box. And so then that's the instructions that he would give to everybody else. And for example, if you're asking, or if you're talking about the number of Harry Potter movies, this came up in my family, and I said, oh, there's more than I thought. There's like 10. Well, to me, that's close. It's close to however many movies there were, and that shows that there's a lot of them. But my son would just say, nope, there's 8. So like 10 is not acceptable. There's either the right answer or the wrong answer. And it's a black and white world. It's a black and white way of thinking for the concrete operational thinker. We also see the potential for expertise. And even at the end of early childhood, we could see with practice, with opportunity, fine motor skills rivaling adults. So of course we have the classic example of super young Tiger Woods looking like he had a beautiful golf swing. Of course, I don't think much of that was natural. It's because he was golfing at a very early age. He wanted to do it, and his parents wanted to provide him the opportunities. And so then you get prodigy or expertise level functioning. Of course, we can think of lots of sporting examples, but we can also think about games. Chess is another example that will come up in the following slide. So for example, if we take two groups, college students who don't know chess and children with chess experience, and then provide them with two different scenarios. One, you have chess pieces randomly placed on the board, and then you take them away and ask the person to put as many back in their original place. Well, college students will have more efficient memory in general than children, and so they'll do better with the random numbers. But children with chess experience, if you've had chess experience and you have, for example, the other paradigm where you're taking the pieces away that were in the middle of an actual game, you're not just seeing individual pieces of information, you're seeing pattern. And you're seeing, well, this one would have to be here because the other piece had to be here. And you see that children can get more right with this one. What's kind of weird to me is that I don't know why the college students would get a lot more right in the random and then have less performance in game, but that's what we actually see. So the idea is that high level repetition and pattern understanding can really start to blossom in middle childhood, and it's a product of a lot of reps and a lot of exposure to whatever the performance task is. Now we're going to move into talking a little bit about educational and testing kinds of issues, because notice we haven't talked about intelligence hardly at all up to this point. And that's because it hasn't really solidified in a strong way. But now that we're into middle to late childhood, pre-adolescence, patterns of intelligence start to show themselves and they start to become stable. So that means we can start to test it and ask ourselves questions about what do we do with it. So leading up to that, we have convergent thinking. This is your classic multiple choice test where there's one right answer and you have to find it. You have to converge on that one right answer. Now, convergent thinking is just easier to design accurate tests for, but we can't forget about divergent thinking as well. So the classic list of things you can do with a brick. Not only will creative people come up with lots more uses, but they'll come up with a lot more details. So now let's just say that you can use a brick as a paperweight, but they'll explain which position it would work best at and different context or different kinds of paperweight. Maybe that wasn't the best example, but you get the idea. It's not just coming up with more things, but it's the amount of detail and context that they provide too. So the idea of does brainstorming work? I think it's an important tool because if people are just focused on one right answer, they're going to close their minds off to other potential solutions. We can also take intelligence and break it up into different chunks. There are literally hundreds, maybe thousands of different theories and breakdowns and analyses, but one of the biggest ones that I think has had a lot of staying power is this idea of Sternberg's triarchic or three-part breakdown of intelligence. So first of all, we have the analytical. This is typically things that are most often measured on standardized tests and in classrooms. We all talked about the creative intelligence, and again, some people who may not have a lot of analytical intelligence, and we can think about CEOs. like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, clearly had a good amount of creative intelligence and seeing opportunities that other people didn't see. And then we have this third kind of intelligence that is often underrated. So you can think about it as street smarts. Some people, especially the military, might think of it as situational awareness. But these are people who may not be creative, they may not test well in terms of analytical intelligence, but they tend to just make smart decisions in real life. They're good with their money, they don't get in trouble with the law, they keep a job, and I think that's a meaningful thing to measure too. And here's an example of a somewhat traditional practical or tacit intelligence measure. This is called a situational judgment test. And oftentimes you don't just have this designed by a consulting company and put it down with the best and right answer, but instead you would have, if you're using this as a test to measure whether somebody is going to succeed on the job, you would have actual experts who are doing the job currently are the ones to come up with these potential solutions and the ones to rate the best and worst. So for one organization, calling off might be the best thing to do. In another organization, it might be filing a formal complaint. There's no one right answer. It just depends on can you identify what's best for this particular situation. And that seems to be a good way to think about how practical intelligence works. We also have some additional cognitive terms to think about. We'll start with Gardner. Howard Gardner, any discussion of intelligence has to at least mention him. He's the one who came up with almost 100 different kinds of sub-intelligence. And I think we can say that many of them there is evidence for, but are they really important to measure? I think the idea is that we just can't get in the box of relying on general intelligence and always thinking about IQ or that one thing as defining whether someone is able to do certain things. We also have this aspect of cognition called metacognition, and it is thinking about how you think. So using memory tricks or using helpful hints. And these are some things that people who, for example, working on a math problem would just keep banging their head against the wall or the desk trying to get it right. If you're using metacognition, you try one aspect, one rule. If that doesn't work, step back, identify another rule, try to apply that, and eventually you'll get the right answer that way. And it's identifying inefficiencies in things that you're doing. It's not about your ability, it's about your strategy. So, for example, young kids often just don't do a lot of metacognition, right? You put a worksheet in front of them, put a pencil in their hand, and they just start doing it. But you want to make sure to teach them the idea of metacognition. And so first of all, you've got to equip them with some strategies. Here's some things you might want to think about. Then you have to work with them to, in that moment, in the middle of the task, instead of just getting tunnel vision, to step back and do the metacognition. And then, of course, you have to evaluate after the task is over, did my application of these rules help or not? And if not, then I have to learn some other ones. And so it's an iterative or circular process to do more metacognition. And again, kids are often have a lot of ability. They understand things, but they might not be getting good grades because they don't do the metacognition. They don't self-regulate to step back and think, did I show my work on the math problem? Did I sign my name? Did I use proper punctuation? And so metacognition will help to resolve some of those, what we call little things, but the little things can clearly add up. I thought this is kind of a funny example of metacognition. Sometimes we don't know how our brain is working, and that's one of the ironies, is that, if we, for example, are working on some sort of muscular movement. We're trying to learn how to throw a baseball. We're trying to learn how to shoot a jump shot in basketball. Well, we can feel our muscles working, but when we are using our brain, we don't feel our brain working. And so it still remains kind of a black box, and metacognition is one way to try and open up that black box of how the brain is working just a little bit. So now we're ready to talk about IQ, or general intelligence. And again, most times we want to think in terms of sub-intelligence. We don't need someone who's super smart across the board to work a register or to wait tables. They need certain kinds of intelligence, maybe emotional intelligence, maybe numerical math intelligence. But for most applications, you can use specific kinds. But we also can't ignore that if we measure people's general intelligence, often referred to as IQ, it really is related to all sorts of usually good things in life. They make more money, the people who have higher IQ, they get better jobs, they live longer. And so it is an important thing because it's related to so many successful aspects of adult life. It's not everything, it's not a perfect predictor, but high levels of IQ on average predict better things for lots of desirable outcomes. So specifically, if we wanted to get the best gold standard IQ measure, there's what's called the Wechsler, and you can see it's got a lot of pattern completion, logic problems. There's the adult version, and specifically for our purposes, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for kids. So if we wanted to get the best measure, the one we would trust the results the most, Wechsler would probably be the way to go. But there's lots of other IQ tests out there. Generally, it's important to consider that the questions themselves are important, but it's also the research and all the data representative samples that have gone into it that are kind of not visible to the test taker, but also are crucial to determining the precision of the actual result. And then we see, for example, the Raven's matrices. Some people say that some questions on the Wechsler are biased because they have English questions and maybe some concepts that non-English speakers wouldn't know. So you have other options. This is a non-verbal test. And again, it may not be face valid. The questions may look weird because it's just a bunch of pattern completion. But the results of people who score high on the Wechsler, which we will say have high IQ, they're also likely to score pretty high on the Raven's matrices too. So that means it is actually valid in a statistical statistical perspective, even though these random pattern completion doesn't seem to be related to important things that we're going to do in our lives. The test works even though it's not clear why the questions work. If you're able to get a lot of these pattern completions questions correct in a short amount of time, you're going to have high IQ. Intelligence is just one kind of standardized test, and we've definitely in this country had a big debate over the use of standardized tests. And I think if anybody listening to this remembers the No Child Left Behind Act, this was the idea that in the early 2000s, the George W. Bush administration, it was widely believed that schools were failing our children. And some schools were particularly bad at being low performers. And, well, how do you measure that? And the idea was, well, we're going to do more standardized testing, and we're going to put stakes behind it. If you keep having low-performing students, then you might lose funding as a school. Clearly that was not popular and in some ways not fair, because if a school just has students with lower socioeconomic status and maybe the school doesn't have enough funding to do what other schools have a lot of money in their tax district, you can't blame it all on the school, but also you can't let them completely off the hook either. So I think the idea is maybe we went too much in the way of standardized testing. And consider, again, a standardized test has all this machinery behind it that's not necessarily in the test booklet or the questions. It's a bunch of the research behind it. Whereas an unstandardized test, it's, let's say you got an A on a history test. That tells you that you know a certain amount of knowledge about that topic, but it does not tell you where you stand relative to other people. And that's the advantage of standardized testing. It gives you the answer of where did I do relative to other people on this test. Are you in the top 10%, the bottom 25%? The standardized test can give you that answer. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of how we got here in terms of standardized testing. Basically, the guy who popularized the term IQ was Lewis Terman, and he got great access to a California school district, or many California school districts. And he was the first to really take the idea of intelligence and apply it to people. He put his money where his mouth is, and he said, I think intelligence is not just a way to identify students who might be falling behind. Intelligence is something more than that, and it's something that, according to him, would be crucial for high performance. So he developed his test, his IQ test, gave it to a bunch of kids, picked the best of the best, and then did that again. So he had just this sample of his, basically, what were called his termites, and those were the highest scoring of the highest scoring kids that he thought were going to be the next big CEOs and Supreme Court justices. So he tracked them longitudinally. Now, what he found out was that, in fact, some of the students that he tested but did not determine to have high enough intelligence to win a Nobel Prize actually did win Nobel Prizes. He only got part of the equation right. So intelligence, yes, it is a good ability, and more of it predicts good things for you, but that's only part of the equation. You also have to have motivation, and he did not include that factor. And so, of course, if you have high intelligence, on average, you're going to have generally a good life. It's not a guarantee, but it is a good predictor. But only when you combine the interactive effect of high intelligence with high motivation, that's when you have the extraordinary high performance levels, your Nobel Prize winners, your Supreme Court justices. So I'm making a little joke here that he only got the nerds, but there is a little bit of truth in that he did miss out on some of the aspects of high performing people. Now, just a couple things to keep in mind, and these aren't necessarily going to be big terms for the exam, but when we're talking about what teachers do in terms of making kids perform better, it may seem like an easy question, but when you introduce a new teaching technique, oftentimes you'll change performance, but not for the reasons that you think or that you hypothesize. So sometimes you'll have what's known as the Pygmalion effect, and this idea that a Greek character will change based on expectations. It's also similar to the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's a classic study called the Bloomer study. You randomly pull out 10 kids from a classroom, and again, this is random, and you tell the teacher that these 10 kids have been identified to be high performers. They have a lot of potential. So then you track these kids to the end of the year, and again, they were randomly pulled out of the class. They weren't high performing to start with, just the teacher thought so. But by the end of the year, these bloomers were actually performing better. So there was nothing special about them before, but now they were performing better just based on teacher expectations. So then you work backward and you find out that the teacher for bloomers asked more questions of them. They got more attention. They weren't allowed to get away with being lazy as much. So the expectations of a teacher really matter, independent of the actual teaching that they're doing. And of course, that can work in a good way, and it can work in a negative way too. If a teacher, for maybe unintentional or intentional bias, identifies a kid as having low potential, self-fulfilling prophecy, by the time the teacher's done with them, they probably will perform lower. We also have the idea of the Hawthorne effect. This is an old-timey study in that basically in this factory, they would change the temperature, the lighting, and the placement of the machines, all sorts of stuff that they just messed around with. And it seemed like everything they did caused performance to improve. And like a placebo effect, the performance change wasn't caused by the light itself. It was caused by the people noticing that something was changing. And so, for example, if one teacher is doing a different teaching technique than another teacher, the kids are going to talk about it, the kids are going to know about it. And if one class does better, is it just because that they knew they were getting something different? And so to really show whether something like a teaching technique causes an improvement in performance, you have to do an experiment. But a true experiment is going to be tough to do in an educational setting. So that's the challenge. There's lots of teaching techniques that seem to be correlated with better student performance in one way or another, but unless it's a true experiment, it could be confounded by either of these effects. And finally, as we wrap things up, we'll end with some thoughts on IQ. So basically, IQ has this weird effect in that it seems to be more influenced by nurture in early childhood, and then once we get to adolescence and leave childhood behind, the correlations between adoptees and their adopted parents start to diverge, and the adopted children IQ tends to converge more starting in adolescence with their biological parents. So something about this genetic influence that seems to express itself more once childhood is gone. So I guess what this means, practically speaking, is parenting matters throughout childhood and adolescence. What parents do makes a difference, but what they are doing seems to matter more. It seems to have a higher correlation with intelligence and a higher correlation with proper school functioning in childhood, and less so once high school hits and later on. And I think that can sort of conflict with some patterns of development in terms of adult. We'll get to adulthood later on the semester, but adults often have to feel like they're choosing a little bit between their family and their putting food on the table, their career. And I think some parents might make the mistake thinking that, well, I'm going to make sure I've got a good job and that I'm well entrenched there and safe. And then once my child's a little older, then I can really dig in and be the best parent I can. And there's no right answer in that predicament. But I think the idea that you can just make up for lost time is just not supported by the research. And so I think workplaces need to be very understanding, and I think we're having some more progressive policies about making it easier to be a parent when your kids are young. And so today we are at childhood's end. It seems like it's been so fast, but Chapter 6 will involve adolescence, and then we'll see the experience of adolescence and the development of adolescence start to differ a lot compared to the childhood stuff that we've talked about. So hopefully there's a lot of stuff that you find interesting and that we can talk about in discussions moving forward.